navigate issues and make sure that he was in the appropriate spot at the appropriate time to be part of the conversation. That's one of those talents in politics that you really can't put a value on, but he was always part of those conversations. And I think he liked that. I think he enjoyed not just necessarily having the platform personally as a senator, like, yeah, of course, people are in politics because they think that they're the one who can help fix things. But I think he really did enjoy being part of that conversation, whether that was with Democrats in working toward bipartisan solutions, or whether that was his proximity to President Trump and helping the president navigate Congress and put forward some of his own policy preferences and goals. So I think Lindsey Graham enjoyed all of those things, and it's up to people to decide how well they think he did with it, but I think that was one of the things in the job that he liked.
What do you think he would think about Benjamin Netanyahu, whose country is currently involved in a conflict with Iran along with the United States, that Benjamin Netanyahu is here for his funeral today, and along with Volodymyr Zelensky, whose country is involved in a conflict that Lindsey Graham was there engaged with in that final trip before his death?
I think he would love it. I think that, not just, there are a lot of, people who are observing this whole process saying, like, why are these world leaders coming for this senator from South Carolina? But as we're just talking about, all of those international issues in which Lindsey Graham had been involved for years, I think that obviously that would mean a lot to him for them to come and, be part of these ceremonies kind of celebrating his life. But I think he also would recognize the role that these two world leaders coming to these services, coming to Washington, and then tangential to that, also having meetings of their own with President Trump to advocate for a lot of the things for which Lindsey Graham had advocated on their behalf, to now have to do that directly because he can't be part of that conversation anymore. I think he would then be able to reflect on all of that and say, okay, yeah, I did have a significant role in a lot of this because now those guys are coming to do it face to face without me.
Here's what's going to happen when it comes to the goodbye for Senator Lindsey Graham taking place today in Washington. There will be an arrival ceremony on the steps of the Capitol. Lindsey Graham's casket will be moved into the rotunda, and then at 10 a.m. Eastern, the ceremony begins. There'll be an invocation by Margaret Kibben, the chaplain of the United States House of Representatives. Then there will be remarks, first by Sherry Biggs, Republican from South Carolina. Then John Thune, the majority leader in the Senate, will give remarks. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, also scheduled to give remarks. And then there'll be a presentation of various wreaths, a musical selection by the United States Air Force Band. The Reverend Dr. Barry Black, the chaplain of the United States Senate, will give the benediction, and then the Army Band Brass Quintet will play out the late senator. His casket will come back down the steps of the Capitol and will head to the National Cathedral at 2 p.m. Eastern. A memorial service will take place there for Senator Lindsey Graham. President Donald Trump is expected to speak at that service, and we'll have coverage as well on the C-SPAN networks. So it's a day of remembrances for Senator Lindsey Graham. Senator Lindsey Graham spoke at the death of Senator John McCain, was known as those two being the best of friends on Capitol Hill. After John McCain died, who was Lindsey Graham's best friend in Congress? Did he ever replace that friendship on Capitol Hill?
I don't think he did. And I think that part of what we saw in the aftermath of that, I mean, clearly their relationship had been so close. They had campaigned together. They had worked on issues together. They had spent a lot of personal time together. And Lindsey Graham had grown close to the McCain family writ large. And I think what we saw in the absence of that was more of Lindsey Graham's relationship with Donald Trump developing. It's not like, okay, well, he was without his bestie, and so we needed to find a new one necessarily, but it was in terms of alliances as well. And in terms of picking those spots, like we were talking about, and where Lindsey Graham felt he could have the most efficacy, there was less work on the bipartisan or at least more centrist conversations that he and John McCain used to have, along with Senator Joe Lieberman too. I mean, the three amigos and the work that they did. But we saw more of a shift toward developing that relationship with Donald Trump and spending more time at Mar-a-Lago and at the White House and talking about how they were in constant conversation, especially when international conflicts would come up. So I think in Congress itself, Lindsey Graham was kind of a little bit on his own, but it wasn't that he couldn't have an opportunity to then, continue to work on these issues. It's just the shift became more toward maybe the White House and less toward his fellow senators.
There was one op-ed after Lindsey Graham died that sort of viewed Lindsey Graham's career as a series of two different relationships, John McCain and then Donald Trump. What do you think Lindsey Graham would think about that his career is being viewed through the lens of these two other very influential figures in the Republican Party?
I think some of it would make a lot of sense to him. I remember having a conversation with Senator Graham after John McCain's death and asking him, what do you think about the relationship that John McCain and Donald Trump had, which we know was contentious and know that there had been a lot of points of disagreement there. And Lindsey Graham told me at that time that he felt that John McCain would have come around to a lot of aspects of the leadership style and the issues of Donald Trump if he'd only had more time to get to know him. And so that's like always been in Lindsey Graham's mind of, yes, these are these two big political relationships that I've had and been able to work through. And I think he understood that they are part of his own narrative as a politician. And I thought that was a really interesting way for him to think about framing it, that, yeah, ultimately maybe they would have found common ground too.
The hearse carrying Lindsey Graham arriving on Capitol Hill. His casket will be removed from the hearse, brought up to the United States Capitol. The rotunda is where the ceremony is taking place. That will begin in just about 20 minutes. We mentioned 2 p.m. Eastern today, the scene shift to Washington's National Cathedral. All of this you can watch here on C-SPAN live and uninterrupted. Some additional events will take place on Wednesday to say goodbye to Senator Graham, a funeral procession at South Carolina State House for a final visit. The South Carolina State Guard on Wednesday will pick up Graham's remains while law enforcement officers from agencies across South Carolina will gather on the steps. After an F-16 flyover, the State Guard team will carry his casket down Main Street to the First Baptist Church of Columbia for a funeral service. The funeral service itself will be followed by a private family burial in Pickens County, South Carolina. That's the schedule for the remains of the late Senator Lindsey Graham. That arrival service is getting ready to take place on Capitol Hill. We're expecting the honor guard to come down the steps. We're going to let you watch it, and we want to let you see it in its entirety and hear it and experience it. Meg Kennard of the Associated Press will be here to join us after that ceremony to continue to talk about the life and legacy of Senator Lindsey Graham. Let's let you watch for a little bit here as we wait for the honor guard. and we're awaiting the honor guard to come take Lindsey Graham's casket from the hearse to the United States Capitol, to the rotunda for the memorial ceremony that's going to be taking place there. As we wait for that event to begin, we continue to chat with Meg Kennard of the Associated Press, taking her thoughts on this day where the state and the country remembers Lindsey Graham. At this ceremony that's going to happen here, it's Sherry Biggs, representative from South Carolina, John Thune, the majority leader, J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. What are your thoughts on that lineup of speakers here on Capitol Hill to remember Lindsey Graham in the environment in which everyone knew him?
I think it's absolutely appropriate. Obviously, this isn't something that we see very much, this specific kind of ceremony. We've seen, leaders lying in repose or lying in state in the Capitol, but to have this special ceremony, I think it pays tribute to Lindsey Graham's status as a South Carolinian, to have a member of the House delegation, clearly from the area that he once represented, and also to have the Senate majority leader being part of that, and then clearly the vice president, who's not only part of the Trump administration, but also plays a role in the Senate if needed. So I think it kind of hits that trifecta of Lindsey Graham's status as a lawmaker and pays tribute to some of the different roles that he's had there. And I think, when we take stock of all of the different experiences that are part of this, again, it seems like a lot, but Lindsey Graham was kind of a lot in terms of the issue portfolio that he carried, but also the time that he spent and all of the different things on which he worked as he went through the State House in South Carolina, then the House, and then the Senate. And so I think it's a very special circumstance for the Senate to be honoring him like this, but it seems to make sense to me, put in all the context.
And scenes from the Capitol Rotunda as those who have come to remember Lindsey Graham start to arrive there. The casket ceremony will be taking place on the steps and then move through those doors right there, which lead into the United States Capitol and up to the rotunda. We'll, of course, bring you that to its entirety. We ran through the lineup of speakers at this event. I expect at some point in one of these events, whether it's at the National Cathedral or back in South Carolina, Darlene Graham will speak about her brother, the newest senator from South Carolina. Do you know if she's speaking? Do you know what she will have to say?
I'm not sure if she is going to be speaking at those services in South Carolina. What her office has told us is that she's officially taking some time to step away from the politics of the moment, since she is now filing as a candidate to compete in that special primary to replace her brother. But this is obviously a completely overwhelming circumstance for Darlene Graham to find herself in, not only grieving her brother, but also serving in an interim appointment and now campaigning to replace him potentially for a full term. So the amount of things on her plate is obviously unfathomable at this point. Giving a eulogy for anyone that you've cared about is tough in any circumstance, and given the sudden nature of how all of this has come together, plus all of the other roles that she's been thrust into, puts her in a complicated spot. I'm sure she would want to honor him, but the emotion of everything that she's going through and the pressures politically and otherwise might complicate that. So I'm not sure.
Were you surprised? Do you think the voters of South Carolina were surprised that, not that just she was appointed to fulfill the term that Lindsey Graham was elected to, but that now she is seeking to take that position on in the following election?
I think her campaigning for this has come as a surprise. South Carolina voters knew her brother very well and were familiar with her because she was often with him, but they don't know her personally, really, or politically. And so to see her now as a candidate is new for everybody, and trying to figure out what her issue portfolio is, what her stances even are on some of the most basic issues that come up in politics and Senate campaigns, and trying to see her as a distinct political entity away from her brother. With a lot of other big South Carolina Republican names in the race, it's kind of a circumstance I don't think obviously anybody expected, but also trying to navigate how much voters really see her as paying tribute to Lindsey Graham and what he stood for, or trying to figure out if there is another Republican they might want to send into that general election in November.
How would you describe their relationship over the years? How much did you know about her before the death of Lindsey Graham and her stepping into that spotlight?
They were obviously very close. We've heard a lot about the biography in terms of both of their parents dying when she was only 13 in swift succession, and ultimately being adopted by her brother so she could receive his military benefits. And he's always seen himself as somewhat of a caretaker for her. He never married. He's been very close to her family. And she's always been with him at these big political events. When he ran for president in 2016, she spoke. She's been in his campaign ads. I saw her earlier this year when he filed his papers for re-election. So, we've seen her around a lot, but just not really understanding her as a political figure, but more as a personal and family figure. That's kind of the Darlene Graham that South Carolina has become accustomed to. And so trying to see her in a different context is definitely a new feeling.
Tim Scott there with the other senators lining up. What was his relationship like with Tim Scott?
They were pretty close. They were often speaking together at a lot of different events, obviously across the state. Big South Carolina names, both elected statewide. Tim Scott used to joke, he has said that Lindsey Graham would joke with him that, Tim Scott's approval ratings were much higher than his in terms of, after elections. It's not that Lindsey Graham wouldn't win his general election races by, 10, 11 points at times, but he just joked that Tim Scott was more popular. But they had a good rapport, I think. And at the prayer breakfast on Capitol Hill last week, Senator Scott hosted in Lindsey Graham's honor. He spoke very favorably about the time that they spent together, as did the other members of the South Carolina House delegation who were mostly there, almost all there.
We've been talking about Lindsey Graham again ahead of this memorial service in the Capitol Rotunda, and we've been talking mostly about his Senate career. We should not forget that he was a member of the United States House, and the Rotunda is the body of the Capitol that connects the House and Senate together. What should we know about his House career? He came in that 1994 wave with Newt Gingrich. What was he best known for before he became a senator?
I mean, it was obviously that big GOP wave. He was the first Republican elected from his district since Reconstruction era in South Carolina. And so that said a lot to kind of where the state's politics and the national politics at that time were headed. But I think one of the biggest things that people remember from Lindsey Graham's House tenure was the Bill Clinton impeachment and how he was one of the House managers of that whole process, and the somewhat fiery speeches that he gave as the House debated all of those impeachment issues. That kind of put Lindsey Graham on the map in terms of people who were just kind of following national politics. And then a couple of years later, him being elected to the Senate, we just kind of saw his career go from there.
Meg Kennard, Lindsey Graham's casket is on Capitol Hill, and that arrival ceremony getting set to take place. We're going to take viewers to the steps of the United States Capitol on the east front of the United States Capitol. Lindsey Graham's casket arriving on Capitol Hill. The casket of Senator Lindsey Graham is now inside the United States Capitol for a final time. It is a ceremony in the rotunda that's set to begin in just a couple minutes. We'll let you watch it live when it does happen. Later today, the remains of the late senator will head to the National Cathedral for a 2 p.m. service that will include remarks from President Donald Trump. Tomorrow, the senator and his remains head to South Carolina, a ceremony at the State House and a trip down Main Street of Columbia. The funeral service that's taking place will be a public service as well before a private family burial in Pickens County, South Carolina. Meg Kennard, what should folks know about Lindsey Graham and Pickens County, South Carolina, his final resting place?
Pickens County is one of those places in South Carolina when we think about the deeply conservative parts of the state. Yes, it is considered to be a Republican stronghold of a state generally, but Pickens County is one of those deepest of the deep red areas. And it was Lindsey Graham's home area. And he was back there a lot, not just to campaign, but also to, remind the people that he hadn't forgotten where he came from. We've heard a lot, particularly recently, over Lindsey Graham's kind of hardscrabble upbringing and the pool hall and restaurant where he and his sister grew up with their parents and all of that. But I think his constant returning back to that part of the state wasn't just for political purposes. It was to show people, this is where I come from, and I'm still this person. Even though I'm in the Senate, even though I'm meeting with world leaders, all over the place, I'm still a Pickens County guy. And I think that was helpful to him politically, certainly, when people would question, okay, well, who is Lindsey Graham and who's been changing his mind and why is he working with Democrats on all these issues and all those kinds of questions that would come up in particularly primary season when people would accuse Lindsey Graham of not being conservative enough. But he definitely still saw himself as a Pickens County resident, and that was really a place that he loved. And so to see him making that final journey home tomorrow, I think that just makes a lot of sense considering how important that place was to him.
Meg Kennard, I know you are headed to that service at National Cathedral. It's 2 p.m. Eastern today. President Trump is set to speak. We appreciate your time, your coverage of South Carolina and Lindsey Graham over the years with the Associated Press. If you want to follow Meg Kennard on X, it's at Meg Kennard AP. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, anytime.
And now we take you to the rotunda of the United States Capitol. The dignitaries have arrived, and Lindsey Graham's casket set to arrive momentarily. We're waiting for that ceremony, that arrival ceremony. There should be a musical tribute and plenty of remembrances of Lindsey Graham as we await the casket coming through the doors. The prelude from the United States Army Band, the brass quintet, will play in the remains of the senator. An invocation from the Reverend Margaret Kibben, the chaplain of the United States House of Representatives. We're expecting remarks from Sherry Biggs of South Carolina, the United States representative from the Palmetto State. The Honorable John Thune, the majority leader of the United States Senate, will speak, followed by J.D. Vance, the vice president. A musical selection from the Air Force Band, a laying of wreaths, and then the Air Force Band will play out the senator playing out Shenandoah is the song that he had picked. Barry Black, the chaplain of the United States Senate, set to give the benediction, and then the departure ceremony, all set to take place here momentarily. We will let you watch it here on C-SPAN. It's the Capitol Rotunda Memorial Ceremony for the late Senator Lindsey Graham. That's taking place this morning on Capitol Hill. This afternoon, it'll be a service at the National Cathedral here in Washington, all of it being covered live on C-SPAN here at the United States Capitol. It is the chaplain of the United States House of Representatives, Margaret Kibben, who is set to give the invocation. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
Would you pray with me? God of the ages, it is your almighty hand that guides our lives, and often it takes the suddenness of death to see how your divine love shapes and leads each one of us on life's journey. And in these moments of mourning, we necessarily take the time to give thanks for those whose lives have left a lasting and significant impact on us and on so many along the way. We invite your divine presence with us in this ceremony, that you would bless our efforts to honor appropriately the influence and effect Senator Lindsey Graham has had on each one gathered here and on this country and on the world. Give us eyes to see how you led a boy from central South Carolina through a life marked by personal hardship and legendary public service, placing upon him the mantle of leadership that Lindsey Graham bore faithfully and courageously for decades in service to this nation as airman, congressman, and senator. It was you, O Lord, who brought him through adversity, shaping within him an enduring sense of responsibility. It was you who, throughout his noteworthy career, equipped him with his assertive spirit, a force to be reckoned with, while also instilling in him a pragmatic determination to get things done, even when it required negotiating with the other side. It was you who emboldened him with both courage and grace, so that while many would know no tougher adversary, most would realize no better friend. And now, as this patriot rests from his labors and stands before you, may Lindsey Graham hear your own well done, good and faithful servant. It is in your eternal name we pray. Amen. Please be seated.
Senator Darlene Graham, members of the Graham family, Vice President Vance, Majority Leader Thune, and other distinguished guests. I'm incredibly honored to offer on behalf of the people of South Carolina our immeasurable gratitude for the statesman and even better friend, Senator Lindsey Graham. When people talk about Lindsey Graham, they often talk about the titles he has held: the congressman, the senator, the chairman, the colonel. But titles only tell a small part of the story. To truly understand Lindsey, you have to understand his deep love for South Carolina and his family, and his belief that public service is a responsibility, not simply a position. To say he loved South Carolina is an understatement. He loved every city in our small but very powerful state. And he always carried South Carolina traditions with him. He understood the people of our state, our independence, our values, our willingness to work hard, and our desire for leaders who will stand up for what they believe is right. Whether walking the streets of his hometown, meeting with locals, or representing South Carolina on the world stage, he never forgot where he came from. Like most South Carolinians, family meant everything to Lindsey. It drove his passion for service. It drove his fight for policy, and it kept him grounded. Here in Washington, a town where many lose sight of who sent them here and why they're here at all, Lindsey never forgot where he came from or who he was here to serve. What made Lindsey exceptional was his ability to work on difficult issues while maintaining personal relationships with people who disagreed with him. He believed that conversations mattered. He believed that showing up mattered. And he believed that leadership meant finding a way forward even when the path was complicated. And he was also very good at outsmarting the trolls, the armchair critics, and the keyboard warriors. Everyone can recount stories of Lindsey's quick wit, his unforgettable sense of humor, and his ability to make people laugh when you least expected it. He was authentic. He never tried to be someone he wasn't. A legacy is not built only through votes, legislation, or headlines. A legacy is built through the lives touched, the relationships formed, and the focused mission to make a difference over time. Lindsey Graham's legacy is one of service to South Carolina, to our nation, and to the cause of making the world a safer and better place. He spent his life standing for something larger than himself, and that commitment will continue to be remembered by those who had the privilege of knowing him and by generations who will benefit from his service. Perhaps what I'll remember most was his love for our military. Lindsey proudly served for 33 years in the United States Air Force, retiring as a colonel. He deeply understood the sacrifices made by the men and women who wear our nation's uniform because he wore it himself. I am the Congresswoman for the Upstate and a Lieutenant Colonel for the South Carolina Air National Guard. But Lindsey never missed an opportunity to remind me that he outranked me, not only in service, but also in his office in the upper chamber. And you know what? He had earned that right. He loved our service members, he loved our veterans, and he never stopped fighting for him. Just last week, I received a call from a friend that I had served with. He was a colonel, a pilot. He told me years ago he was on an aircraft and Senator Graham happened to be on that plane. He said he thought he never would get him out of the cockpit because he was right in the middle, almost the entire flight, talking to the pilots and learning more about them. That's just who Lindsey was. He wanted to be right there alongside our fighters and our veterans. I was proud to call Lindsey Graham my constituent and honored to have called him my friend. Service is not celebrity nor comfort, and public service is never accomplished by one person alone. Every member knows it takes a team, and he built one of the best teams who faithfully served alongside him. To every member of his Senate staff, both past and present, thank you for your service to Lindsey, to South Carolina, and the United States of America. Your professionalism, your loyalty, and your sacrifice and your loss is recognized. Having served under the Department of the Air Force, Lindsey and I both knew the Airman's Creed, which partly reads, "My mission is to fly, fight, and win." I am faithful to a proud heritage, a tradition of honor, and a legacy of valor. Those words describe Lindsey Graham's life. Through triumph and hardship, victory and criticism, a legacy of service. I remember so well one of my last joint events with Senator Graham. We shared a stage together at a church in our district to discuss our shared support for the people of Israel and to talk about our faith. Those were two topics that were very important to both of us. Senator Graham's death was unexpected. He had a full schedule. He had plans. And in this time of mourning, we're reminded of God's comfort and that His plan is perfect. None of us know when it's our time, but we're reminded that our only eternal hope is found in our Savior. As the Bible reads in the book of Romans, chapter 10, verse 13, "For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." To the Graham family, may God bless you and keep you. And may God continue to show each of us the grace that we do not deserve.
Mr. Vice President, Darlene, Senator Graham, Larry, members of the Graham family, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's difficult to believe that we're here today to say a final farewell to Lindsey as he leaves the Capitol for the last time. My heart is heavy. I feel his absence every day, and I know so many of my colleagues do as well. Senators on both sides of the aisle counted him as a friend. And Republicans and Democrats alike, including the Democrat leader, are here to say farewell. Lindsey was a towering figure here in the Senate and on the international stage. His leadership on national security and on our national defense is well known. I traveled with Lindsey all over the world as part of congressional delegations, and I saw firsthand just how much he was respected by our allies, and just how well he was able to connect with foreign leaders around the globe. Striking, too, was the instant connection he had with the military men and women that we met. They recognized him immediately as one of their own. Lindsey's work on these issues would be enough to cement his place as a leader in the Senate. But he was a leader on many other issues, too. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee in the 116th Congress, he fought tirelessly to advance well-qualified judges. He was serving as chair of the Budget Committee at the time of his death and was responsible for getting important tax relief legislation to the floor. And no tribute to Lindsey's work is complete without mentioning that he was a powerful voice for the pro-life movement. "Until my last breath, I will be fighting for this cause," he said. And he was. He was a fierce defender of Ukraine. He was a fierce defender of the unborn. And on the surface, these might seem like two completely separate issues. But it strikes me that in another way, they are both of a piece. In both cases, Lindsey Graham saw injustice, and he spoke up. And, was as typical of Lindsey, he spoke up fearlessly. "I don't apologize for being pro-life," he said in an interview in 2022, and probably on a number of other occasions. It didn't matter to Lindsey whether an issue was popular or unpopular, whether he had the full support of his colleagues or whether he was standing alone. If he believed he was in the right, he spoke up. He told things the way he saw them, and he didn't mince words. But lest anyone think it was all work and no levity with Lindsey, let me just say that there was no one who took his job more seriously than Lindsey Graham. But also no one was more capable of cracking up a room. During the work week here in Washington, a lot of us are away from our families, so we often get together in groups for dinner. And let me tell you, Lindsey was always the first call. The conversation and the laughs always flowed at any meal where Lindsey Graham was present. He was entertaining always, and pretentious never. There are a lot of so-called self-made people in the world, he once said. I'm not one of them. My family, friends, neighbors, and my faith picked me up when I was down, believed in me when I had doubts. You made me the man I am today, he said. Ladies and gentlemen, Lindsey will be remembered as a senator and as a statesman. But for me, most of all, I will remember him as my friend. It's hard to think that there will be no more Senate dinners with Lindsey, that he won't be dropping by my office to discuss some piece of legislation or make me laugh with his witty commentary. But I cling to the same faith that Lindsey had, to the sure and certain hope of the resurrection and the knowledge that death is not the end. I am the resurrection and the life, says the Lord. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. To Darlene and the Graham family, to Lindsey's beloved staff members, be assured of the prayers of my wife Kimberly and I, and the prayers of so many in this room. And to Lindsey, rest in peace, my friend. I look forward to the days when you make us all laugh again.
Well, first to Darlene and to the Graham family, all of you, I know you loved Lindsey and were proud of him, and he was proud of you, and I'm very, very sorry. It's good to see you all here among his friends and his colleagues, and I also, of course, have to issue my condolences to them. I know so many of you loved Lindsey like I did. So many of you argued with Lindsey, laughed with Lindsey, relied on Lindsey, and I also, of course, want to give condolences to a group of people you sometimes don't hear as often mentioned in the same breath, but I know who loved him, which is his staff. I know all of you worked for him for a long time. Many of you worked for him for longer than, I've been in public service, certainly longer. Some of you even than I've been graduated from high school. Don't mean to age any of you, but what a testament to a man that he has so much loyal and devoted staff. And I think that's the first thing I want to tell about Lindsey Graham. I want to tell some stories, but I also want to make an observation, which is that Lindsey Graham loved people from all walks of life. I think in part because of the way that he grew up, because of the fact that he wasn't handed everything. He was fascinated in everybody. He was fascinated in the wait staff in the Senate dining room. He was fascinated in the people who made the food. He was fascinated in the lowest staffer who had been hired 3 days earlier. He was fascinated by, of course, the very leadership of our country. And I think he was fascinated in people because he loved people and he was interested in them. He was the kind of guy who would walk into the Senate. And when he walked into the Senate, this was a guy who couldn't have stood more than 5'6" or 5'7", but he'd swashbuckle in with his jacket open like he was 6'5". He had an attitude to him, and it's one of the reasons why Lindsey Graham was Lindsey Graham. But he would walk into the United States Senate, and he would slap you on the back. He would greet the person who served his food. He treated everybody the same because he was fascinated and he loved every single person in this chamber. And that's a great testament to the man. You know, I first got to know Lindsey Graham when I was on the Senate campaign trail for my own Senate race in 2022. And I remember riding in the back of the car with him. You know, during these campaigns, you go from one event to the next and to the next event. And I remember learning a lot from him. I had a lot of people who campaigned with me during that time, but I learned something from Lindsey Graham, the way that he interacted with people, the way that he was so interested in what was going on and what was moving people and what was motivating them and what they were interested in. That affection and love of people was obvious even on the campaign trail, but so too was Lindsey Graham's world-class sense of humor. And in one event in particular, we had just left one event, we were riding in the back of the car going to the next event. Lindsey Graham told me a story about his time in the House. And if I repeated exactly what he told me, Darlene, it would be the end of my political career forever. But what I can say is that I was laughing so hard that by the time we got to the next event, I had abdominal cramps and I was barely able to speak because Lindsey Graham could make anybody laugh. And he could make anybody feel at home. I was talking to, a mutual friend of ours, a person who didn't always agree with Lindsey Graham's politics just shortly after his death. And I expected the person maybe to say something critical, but he said, you know what? Even though we sometimes disagreed, I loved Lindsey Graham. It was impossible not to like him. That swashbuckling, infectious laugh, that attitude, that passion that so many others have talked about. Lindsey Graham was impossible not to like as a human being and, of course, as a United States Senator. I remember on that campaign trail where, you're trying to raise money. And one of the ways that you raise money is you send people to your campaign website. And I said, Lindsey, before one of these Fox hits on the campaign trail, I said, Lindsey, could you maybe mention the website, jdvance.com? And over a 4-minute interview, he must have mentioned jdvance.com close to a dozen times. The host would ask, how was the weather? And Lindsey would say, well, before I check the weather, I always go to jdvance.com. And in a 4 or 5 minute TV appearance, Lindsey Graham raised us over $100,000. And that campaign stop was a critical part of me getting elected to the United States Senate and, of course, going on this incredible journey. That was who Lindsey Graham was. I remember once I got to the Senate, getting in this argument with Lindsey, and as John said, as Leader Thune said, he was a fierce defender of Ukraine, and he and I got into this intense argument at a Senate lunch. I think some of our colleagues probably remember this, about a funding bill for Ukraine. And I remember at the end of it going back to my staff, and I was at the time working on a rail legislation that I really, really cared about. And I remember going back to my staff and saying, well, that's probably the end of Lindsey's vote on the railway bill because he is never going to support anything I support after the argument that he and I just had. And of course, I found out a couple of weeks later from another Senate colleague that the fiercest advocate of that bill behind the scenes was Senator Lindsey Graham. Now, Lindsey was who he was, and I knew that Lindsey couldn't even pretend to care about rail policy. It was something I really cared about, but it wasn't something Lindsey was particularly focused on. And so I went to Lindsey and I said, why are you helping me? Why are you helping this legislation? And I expected him to do what so many politicians would do. I expected him to lie and say, well, I really care about rail legislation. And he said, oh, I don't care about that at all. I said, well, why are you helping me? And he said, well, I don't care about it, but you do. And that was the kind of colleague he could be, a person you argued with and fought with in 1 minute, but behind the scenes, without collecting an ounce of credit, was working for you and working for the things that you cared about in the next. That was who Lindsey Graham was. Before I knew Lindsey, One of the most enduring parts of his legacy is I do believe that Justice Kavanaugh would not be on the Supreme Court were it not for his fierce advocacy during a critical moment. Remember that Senate confirmation hearing where Lindsey, and by the way, he got criticism from the Republican side of the aisle for this. He would always vote for qualified Democrat judicial nominations. He came to the judicial nomination process in a spirit of bipartisanship. Again, he was criticized sometimes from our side of the aisle for that, but what he saw happening to Kavanaugh was not a policy disagreement, it was character assassination. And Lindsey got as fiery and as passionate as I have ever seen a human being get during a judicial confirmation, and I believe that he saved that nomination. Now, that moment, of course, went viral, but Lindsey didn't do it for social media clicks. He did it to do something at the very highest part of the Senate, which was to persuade his colleagues. And persuade his colleagues he did. I remember there were a few people who were waffling at that moment, a few people who were unsure what they were going to do. Lindsey didn't just earn a lot of headlines, he actually persuaded people. And that maybe is how I will choose most to remember my friend Lindsey Graham. He saw that the Senate, at its very worst, could be a venue for character assassination. But because he loved people, he saw that the Senate at its very best could be a deliberative body geared towards persuading people. And that's what Lindsey Graham did in that case and in so many others. So I choose to remember Lindsey Graham as a man who could disagree with you without being disagreeable. I choose to remember Lindsey Graham as a person who could fight with you on one issue but fight for you on another issue. I remember Lindsey Graham as a man who loved people. And because he loved people, he was willing to reason with them, to respect them, and ultimately to persuade them. May God comfort all of those who loved Lindsey Graham, particularly his beautiful family. And may God rest the soul of Senator Lindsey Graham, a true American original.
Lord God and guide the ones who fly through the great spaces of the sky. Be with them traversing the air in darkening storms or sunshine fair. Thou dost keep us stayed with delight, for us stands each one their flight. Thou of the tempered winds beneath, that having thee they know no fear. Control their minds with instinct fit, what time and venturing they quit. The firm security of land grants steadfast Smiling valley, and hear your rolling river. I long to see your smiling valley, where we're bound away across the wide Missouri. "'Tis so long years since last I sailed on
Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the inspiration of the life and legacy of Senator Lindsey Graham. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world by giving us the gift of someone who sought to leave the world better than he found it. Inspired by his great life, teach us all to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. Continue to bless and keep us. Make your face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. Lift the light of your countenance upon us and give us your shalom, your wholeness, your peace. We pray in the name of the Prince of Peace. Amen.
You've been watching lawmakers join friends and family of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, honoring his life and legacy at this memorial service on Capitol Hill. Later today, we'll have live coverage of the funeral service at the Washington National Cathedral in D.C. That will include remarks from President Trump and Fox News host Sean Hannity. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are also expected to attend. That begins at 2 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN. Also on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app, and online at cspan.org. Up next, we'll take a look at Senator Graham in 2008 delivering a keynote speech at a conference on U.S. foreign policy where he talked about foreign affairs and national security challenges facing the nation.
It's fun for me to be able to talk to people who really care about the world and where we're going to go and how we get there. And you know, growing up, anybody been to South Carolina? Woohoo! Come back, spend money. You know what I like about politics is the only place only in America can you make 800 on the SAT and go to the Senate. You know, and that's both parts. So you gotta kind of limits your options in terms of employment. So this is, no think tanks were available for me, so I went to the Senate. But you know, growing up in rural South Carolina, my dad and mom owned a restaurant, a liquor store, and a pool room. And the skills I learned in the pool room have served me well in foreign policy. It's not a whole lot different than you know, when you meet people and try to figure out where to go as a nation and how to solve problems. Some of the basic human skills of being a lawyer or a business person really does serve you pretty well. What I thought I'd talk about is the next president, whoever he or she may be. I'm not writing Hillary off. Other people are, but I'm not. Whoever he or she may be is going to have a chance to start over. You know, isn't it wonderful in life to start over? You know, you get every 4 years we have a chance to, in our democracy, to start over. And I really do admire President Bush. He's a friend, and he's had a lot of hard decisions on his watch. But the reality of the next president is that the world will be looking for a chance to start over with America. And one of the honest truths out there is that during the last several years for world leaders, it's been tough at times to to engage the United States without political problems at home. Tony Blair has had some political problems at home. You know, for those, the British friends here, shag means something different than South Carolina. But we'll leave it at that. But anyway, I think the world, whatever problems the Bush administration's had building coalitions, has a lot to do with the fact that political leaders, and particularly Western countries, but not just Western countries, have had a pretty tough time at home dealing with the administration because it's not politically popular. Well, that's going to pass. So we'll have a chance here right after the new president's sworn in to do some things then that we can't do now. And I really do believe that a lot of the animosity that's been generated is not permanent toward America. That at the end of the day, the world really does like us, even though they disagree with us at times. And the world will be yearning to have a new relationship with the next American president, because it's in the world's interest to have a strong America that can build coalitions. And when you think about what awaits the next president, the first thing that comes to my mind is Iran. How many people here believe the Iranians are trying to develop a nuclear weapons program, not nuclear power? For those on C-SPAN, it was better than my primary results, more than 2 to 1. How many people think they're 3 years away before they can develop a nuclear weapon? 2 years? 4 years? How many people don't know? Okay. Now just think about that. How many people here believe that if Iran developed a nuclear weapons program, it would be very destabilizing? One of the more dangerous scenarios you could think of. Raise your hands. All right. Now, how many people want to use military force against Iran? Good answer. Nobody. But if you believe it would be a great destabilizing event that could lead to a nuclear arms race in the Mideast, which could lead to a lot of bad things, and that time is not on our side, how do you change that dynamic? I think that's what President Bush is trying to decide this week. And the next president of the United States can inherit the solution they find this week, or will have to come up with one of their own. I would argue that the way that we deal with this problem is that we first start with Iraq. I've always believed, whether we should have gone to Iraq or not, that the outcome in Iraq is certainly not specific to that country. That the moment we decided to topple Saddam Hussein, we put Iran in play. And Al-Qaeda chose to follow us in Iraq. I'm not saying they were there before, because they probably weren't, but they chose to follow us there. So we put Al-Qaeda in play. Whether that was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, I think it's a fact. At least I think Senator McCain believes that. I certainly do. Now, how we leave and the outcome in Iraq has become hugely important to other national security needs of the world and the nation. And in that regard, you have to look at Iraq beyond Bush's war. It is Bush's war here at home, but it is, the outcome is not specific to President Bush. It is specific to all of us. So I think Senator McCain's first task, if he becomes president, is to convince the world that Iraq is not President Bush's problem. It is our problem, the world's problem. The good news, from my point of view, is that the surge has produced results beyond my expectations. Like politics, wars, you have winners and losers, generally speaking. Sometimes I guess you can tie. This war in Iraq is not yet over, but I would argue that the change in strategy that we've employed under General Petraeus' leadership has resulted in a great diminishment of Al-Qaeda. that they so far are one of the biggest losers of the surge. And I would say a close second would be Iran. Because as a result of this change in strategy, something pretty magical, I think, is going on in Iraq. If I had to describe in one soundbite the biggest success of the surge for the United States or the world at large, it would be that with better security, Muslims in Iraq who tasted the al-Qaeda agenda in Anbar province said no and joined with us. Anytime Muslims in Iraq or any other place will take up arms against the forces of bin Laden and his agents and side with us, we're all safer. And don't underestimate that one event, that the diminishment of al-Qaeda throughout the Arab and Muslim world is real. They quite simply overplayed their hand. And whether it was luck or strategy, ever how you'd want to account for it, the fact of the matter is that they overplayed their hand and to our benefit. The old strategy was empowering Iran and al-Qaeda because it created a vacuum in Iraq that was to the benefit of the Iranian regime, and al-Qaeda was filling that vacuum. The new strategy has allowed a different outcome regarding the two forces I've just described. Iran, I think, has been diminished in the sense that the Iraqi political leadership, starting from the bottom up, have come to the conclusion that they would rather be governed by Iraqis than al-Qaeda or Iran. That the Shias in Iraq are beginning to understand that they can have a very large say and a dominant role by dealing with the Sunnis and the Kurds in Iraq, and this idea of being an extension of an Iranian theocracy is losing its charm. Every day that goes by where there's better security and political compromise in Iraq, Iran grows weaker. So those who say that our presence in Iraq makes Iran stronger, I could not disagree more. That was true under the old strategy. It is not true now. Three things that have happened in Iraq that are, to me, very important. Being a politician, the hardest thing to do as a politician many times is to sit down with the other side. Trust me, I know. I had a photo with Senator Kennedy, and God bless him, during the immigration debate, and it was all over South Carolina. And me and Senator Kennedy joke about that. And I hope and pray for a speedy recovery. And he is a wonderful man and a great senator. But during this bipartisan effort to find consensus on immigration, I got my brains beat out at home. Now, I know how hard it is in American political society to engage in give and take. Imagine sitting down with someone on the other side who literally may have been involved in killing your family. The fact that the Iraqis were able to produce a budget, a $48 billion central government budget, where every group within Iraq felt ownership of that budget, to me is a major step forward. It is the Sunnis, the Shias, and the Kurds saying to each other, this is your money too. From a politician's point of view, that is a very serious statement to make. Do not underestimate how important it was to reach a consensus on sharing the wealth of Iraq if it's just for a year. Being a military lawyer and somewhat of a student of history, one of the things that you have to come to grips with when you have civil strife is forgiveness. The hardest act of all in politics is to forgive. The easiest thing in politics is to scapegoat, demagogue, and blame. It's fun. It gets people excited. Forgiveness is a different matter. The general amnesty law that was passed was a statement by the Shias and the Kurds to the Sunnis. Let's start over. I think 19,000 applications for amnesty have been made by Sunni prisoners, and most of them have been granted. These are people that a year or 2 years ago were taking up arms against the Shia and Kurdish populations, trying to topple the central government in Baghdad. And because of better security, there was a political compromise dealing with the hardest of all compromises, forgiving someone who took up arms against you. The fact that they were able to reach a consensus to allow some of the Sunni insurgents to go back to their villages and start over is a major, major step forward. Finally, provincial elections. I believe they will happen this fall. The election law is almost worked out, just about done. That's a statement by the Sunnis to the Shias and Kurds. Instead of sending bombs and bullets to Baghdad, let's sit down and send representatives. They boycotted the 2005 election. I'll make a prediction to you that if there are elections in the fall, which I believe there will be massive Sunni turnout. That is a sea change in terms of how the Sunni minority views the new Iraq. Do not underestimate these three political compromises. Do not underestimate how far we have to go. Finally, before I take some questions, the question I think for Senator McCain or anybody else who wants to be president is, are we at war? And if we are at war, who are we at war with? How many people believe the attacks of 9/11 were a crime against America? Okay? How many people believe that the attacks of 9/11 on our homeland were an act of war against America? You got to choose. How many people choose crime? How many people choose war? About half. Does it matter? Yes. It matters a great deal in terms of the policies you will pursue and the legal framework from which you will operate from. No matter what theory you use to prosecute those who attacked us, the one thing is for sure: the high ground in this war is not a place. It is an idea. We're fighting for the moral high ground. There is no capital to conquer, no navy to sink, or air force to shoot down. We're battling an idea. And the compliment you gave me about detainee policy was much appreciated. But Senator McCain has understood from day one that the way we win this war is not simply killing terrorists. It is empowering forces of moderation to join with us and over time isolate this extreme movement that has no place on the planet for anyone who may be different. And there are many people on the fence. And when we say, Senator McCain and Senator Graham say, that the moment you capture a prisoner, it becomes about us, not them, that was not well received, at least in parts of South Carolina. Why do you want to give these people lawyers? They will cut our heads off. And why do you care about how we treat them? Because they'll kill all of us. And the answer that I tried to give, and Senator McCain knows better than anyone I've ever met, is it is about us.
And we're going to break away from this program, take you back live to the east front of the United States Capitol, where the coffin carrying Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, is being carried down the steps with an honor guard. Live coverage here on C-SPAN. A live shot of the hearse bearing the casket of Senator Lindsey Graham as they prepare to depart and head to the Washington National Cathedral, where the funeral service will take place at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Our live coverage continues here on C-SPAN. This afternoon, we'll have live coverage of the funeral service for the late Senator Lindsey Graham at Washington National Cathedral in D.C. That will include remarks from President Trump and Fox News host Sean Hannity. That's expected to begin at 2 p.m. Eastern live here on C-SPAN, also on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app, and online at cspan.org. More now from the C-SPAN archives with Senator Lindsey Graham announcing his candidacy for president back in 2015. This took place in his hometown of Central South Carolina and included introductory remarks from his sister, Darlene Graham.
Good morning. It's so good to be home. I look out, I see so many familiar faces, faces of friends and family, and I just want to thank you all for joining us on this very special day. As many of you know, Lindsey and I grew up in one room in the back of those buildings right there. Not one bedroom, but one room where we lived, we slept, and we ate. And our parents ran a pool hall, a bar, and a restaurant in those buildings where they worked long, hard hours to earn a living to support us. That instilled a very strong work ethic and important values in both Lindsey and me. I have some great memories of this town. One of my fondest memories is Lindsey teaching me how to ride a bicycle on that sidewalk right over there. He would hold on to the bicycle as I pedaled, and he'd run along beside of me, give me a big push and shout, "Keep pedaling, keep pedaling." And then he was the one who comforted me when I stopped pedaling and fell off the bicycle. As I got a little older, Lindsey started to college. Our parents were so proud. He was the first in our family to go to college. When he left, we missed him terribly. I can remember being so excited on Fridays, I couldn't wait to get out of school. I knew Lindsey was on his way home for the weekend. I would stand on that sidewalk what seemed like forever, waiting on the Greyhound bus. And when he arrived, we would be so excited to run back down the street to see our parents. And as excited as I was to see Lindsey, I think I was more excited to see the expression on my mother's face when we walked through that front door and she saw him. When I was around 10, I remember our parents had finally saved enough money to buy that